The other day I had a burial at the cemetery, not St. Peter's Cemetery, but across the street there's a city cemetery there. And I was looking at some of the gravestones, the markers that are there, and a lot of them have interesting expressions there, and a couple caught my eye. One of the markers said on it, "What I am, you soon will be." Another marker said, "I was once like you will one day be like me." And finally, one in Latin, "Memento mori," which is remember death. Remembering the reality of our death is not a pleasant thing to do. And in fact, we oftentimes try not to think about it. It can lead us to feel despair, heartbrokenness, a bit gloomy. However, in the gospel today, Jesus is asking us to remember the end, the fact that one day we will die. Jesus, however, has a very important reason for doing this. Jesus in the gospel today speaks about the end of time, the end of our own lives, in order to encourage us to make the choice to live well. We're approaching very rapidly the end of the church liturgical year. Next Sunday is the Solemnity of Christ the King. Always at this time of year, the Gospels are filled with these readings in which Jesus speaks about the end of time, the coming judgment that will come upon the earth. In this way, Jesus builds upon many of the prophets, such as the prophet Malachi, who we heard in the first reading. Many in the prophetic movement in Israel talked about a so-called Day of the Lord, when God would come to judge those who have been done good, but also to restore justice and punish those who had done evil. Jesus then is speaking in this prophetic tone. It's also kind of apocalyptic tone, in which Jesus uses a lot of symbols and imagery to impress upon us that in the end, Christ will return. Maybe that's at the end of history or at the end of our lives. For this reason, then, we are to make a choice. Jesus is clear in the gospel that we do not know the time or the date in which Christ is returning, but we are always wanting to live our lives such that we are ready to meet Jesus. Jesus talks about the end to remind us in a way that we can live our present reality well. These two markers are trying to make the same statement. The individuals who put them there wanted people who passed by not only to remember them, to pray for them, but also to remember the reality that their life is a gift and life is limited. Therefore, we are to live the life we've been given in this current existence and live it well. This is what Christ calls us to in the gospel. Remembering the reality of our death, especially when we remember it with Christ, has a few advantages. It can, of course, lead us to gloom if we're not careful, but we always look at our death with Jesus, and that gives us hope in eternal life. But when we remember the reality that an end will come, it helps us live better in a few ways, and I'd like to mention two this evening. First, when we remember the fact that one day we will die, it helps us oftentimes clarify decisions or how we should live our life in the best way possible. Might have spoken about this before, but the great St. Ignatius of Loyola had a very interesting and powerful meditation that revolved around this. St. Ignatius of Loyola was living in the 16th century, the founder of the Jesuits, and he has a wonderful work called the Spiritual Exercises. And what it is really a list or kind of a collection of meditations. And these meditations are to help us reflect upon our life and the gospel and how we can make choices to more closely follow Jesus. St. Ignatius of Loyola, within the Spiritual Exercises, has what he calls a deathbed meditation. And it's not meant to be, again, kind of gloomy, but it's meant to help clarify choices. So St. Ignatius encourages us that if we're trying to make a decision in our life, and here we're talking about important or major decisions, not maybe where I'm going to have dinner this evening, but important decisions that we need to make, St. Ignatius of Loyola encourages us to imagine ourselves close to the end of our life, there on our deathbed, and to ask ourselves this question: if I'm there about to pass away from this existence, which decision do I had wished that I would have made? It helps really to clarify our choices when we think that in the end we will have to kind of look back on our lives, and we don't want to look back on our lives with regret. Therefore, one positive thing that comes about remembering the reality of our death is it helps us clarify our choices to see what is truly important. Another really important kind of characteristic or feature that comes from remembering death is the fact that it helps us to overcome procrastination. Jesus oftentimes in these Gospels that look forward to the end recalls the time of Noah, or he talks about kind of daily practices that people are getting caught in, important practices, getting married, having children, working, eating, drinking, things like this. The regular kind of rhythms of life at times can oftentimes distract us from making those important choices. Today, we're able to distract ourselves in an even easier way, doom scrolling on our phones, kind of watching one show after another on Netflix. It's an easy way to distract us from important things that we know God is calling us to do. I was talking to a friend the other day, and he was speaking about going to this celebration. It was a birthday celebration for someone who was struggling with an illness. It wasn't clear if this person would live for much longer. It was a bit uncertain. But at this birthday celebration, it turned into a very profound and beautiful experience because everyone at the end of the celebration was getting up and giving speeches. And they were saying such beautiful and powerful things to that individual because, again, it was a bit uncertain how much time they had left. But my friend was remarking to me that it was so beautiful to witness and so wonderful to see people saying these things to that person before they had passed on. Oftentimes, we kind of express things to people maybe at the eulogy, at a funeral, things that we wish we had said earlier. We do not want to procrastinate doing the good that God is calling us to do, whether that has to do with restoring a relationship, serving in a new way, or pursuing some different path to follow Jesus. When we consider the fact that our time is limited and that it is a gift, it helps us overcome this procrastination, to realize that life is truly a gift, and so we want to live each day well. Jesus in the gospel today, then, does not talk about the end of time, the end of our lives, in order to discourage us or to fill us with gloom. As Christians, when we consider the end of our existence, it's always through the lens of hope, because we truly believe that Christ has risen from the dead. At the same time, Jesus wants us to know that our lives matter, our choices matter. As we proceed, therefore, towards the end of this liturgical year, let us listen to these profound words of Jesus and really ask ourselves that question: would I be ready now to meet Jesus? What changes, perhaps, is Christ inviting me to make now in my life?